So it's been a while that I've talked about Kaizen. Here we are. Hakari has impressed me. He's probably impressed you as well. And we knew this was something that was on the rise for quite some time. There's been a lot of hype and anticipation for his character, for his abilities, and the showcase that we were evidently going to get. And we definitely got it. One thing that a lot of people were concerned about when it came to Hakari was where his abilities would sit in relations to Yuta, in relations to Gojo. See, now that Gojo is out of the picture, we have to somewhat replace that pillar of power to keep things balanced, to keep things fair, to allow our expectations of fights and things to flow rather naturally and progressively upwards. We need somewhat conclusive pillars to help or aid that progression forward. This would come in the form of both Yuta and Hakari, but Yuta threw in a bit of a curveball, stating that Hakari, when he's on a roll, is infinitely higher than himself. And this led us to speculate a lot of different things. The problem with speculation, however, especially in such a crucial time for building the Culling games very early on, we needed it to be answered. We needed something to affirm our speculation, to make it more legitimate, or to completely break it apart. For us, this is important so we don't miss the building blocks for the Culling games in terms of power structure. What I mean by this is that you've probably noticed that throughout the entirety of this arc beginning, the stepping stones have been getting bigger and bigger. The showcase of power has been getting bigger and bigger. Even the consequences are getting bigger and bigger. This is just a progressive upwards trend that sooner or later plateaus until we reevaluate the story again. This might sound super familiar. This is exactly what Shibuya done, and the reason why Shibuya was so successful and a lot of people really enjoyed it is because it had this exact same formula. This trend of every action or fight one-upping the previous fight. Its next climatic peak would ultimately be higher. And there was a couple of different versions of that climatic peak. On one hand, it would be a showcase of power and ability and scope, and the other, emotional, identity, mindset. That's why one of the most impressive and powerful fights within Shibuya is not a showcase of abilities. It's not a showcase of who's the strongest or who has the most complex power that can be utilized in the best way possible. It was Yuji and Mahito and Todo. It was personal. It had a loss. It was built up for the entirety of Kaizen's narrative prior to Shibuya. It was intimate. So far, we've had very slight variations of this, but we're most likely going to get it much later on. But Hakari was the last key to this puzzle. He was the last person that we knew had a lot of power. We knew would be a very big issue if we didn't see his power, and thus we are currently getting it, and in a very glorious way too, against a very powerful individual known as Kashimo. The thing with Kashimo that concerns me, however, especially with this fight between them, is that he's very unpredictable. It's not unpredictable in the sense of the other people that we've seen within the story currently. He seems more scarily focused on the idea that is Sukuna, and he will do anything to try and gain knowledge on it, to the point where I think it would even be safe to assume that Kashimo would stop fighting in his entirety if he knew where Sukuna was. If he had an idea, if he managed to pull the information, he wouldn't waste any time and just instantly leave the fight to go look for Sukuna. This type of mindset is pretty dangerous for this type of fight and the scale that Hakari is building for our knowledge and our understanding, but because of the prior fight, Kashimo potentially leaving or vanishing or disappearing, whatever it may be, just exiting the fight in general, makes it a little bit easier, a little bit more digestible, which is the reason why I think Akatami put the previous altercation in there with Hakari to show off his ability further without really having a repercussion for it if Kashimo leaves. See, if we took out the previous fight that Hakari had and just focused on Kashimo and getting Hakari's domain expansion and all of the explanation, while it still would have been absolutely incredible, Kashimo potentially leaving or something entirely else happening would either downplay or even devalue what Hakari just introduced. This is the last thing that we want. We want Hakari's intention, his power, his domain expansion to be very clear and precise for us as readers, so now we know where everyone stands. We had to go through the motion of every character within the Culling games, power-wise, to see where they sit. Now that we have all of this information, and Hakari being pretty much the last person to cap it off, we have our pillars of power. We have a great idea where every character sits. We have a great understanding of where the story power-wise can actually go and how much further we can actually take it, which is the most impressive thing about the Culling games, is because we're very early within it. Something is about to change. Something is about to evolve. And with the semi-introduction of Sukuna lurking within the background saying to Yuta that he can't become the next iteration of power, saying that he won't be able to evolve further into a quote-unquote natural disaster, is because he's too human. He's too kind. The only people that reach Sukuna's level or even Gojo's level is people that are selfish, people that indulge within their own desires. And I won't say who exactly, but there's a couple of individuals that teeter on this mindset a little bit. When push comes to shove, their scale could just about reach this limitation of what Sukuna somewhat describes. So that's kind of an overview of the power structure currently and the importance to see it and visualize it, to understand it for us as readers. But also Hakari has been nothing but impressive. His cool, calm and collected attitude and his abilities do not reflect it in the slightest. If anything, it is the complete opposite of his mindset, being one of the most complex, over the top and insanity driven abilities that you can imagine. Something fitting for the type of person that he is, but the overall infrastructure and its complexity is something you probably wouldn't expect. The intricacies of gamblings, the ins and outs, the pulls, reaches, jackpots, everything just flowing back into his character and how much that is actually outputted. This is nothing but brilliant for Hakari, and while it's a little bit overwhelming for us and how Akutami likes to explain things in the most backwards way possible, once you sit down and kind of think about it, it's not the most complex thing to ever exist. It's just taking these slot machine gambling mechanics, mashing them together and supplying Hakari with all the outcomes in some sort of positive way. The problem, however, that gives itself some sort of arbitrary limitation is that Hakari is built off a vibe, off an emotion. He has to be feeling himself to really bring forth this type of energy. And there's a lot of things that help amplify this much further. The fact that music is playing, the fact that he's dancing around and having fun and feeling on fire is great when it works. But if something were to switch it off, if something were to disrupt it, I can imagine the jarring on-off switch that is flickering drastically brings down his performance. And that's not to say that he would be obliterated by Kashimo, but more so the fact that I think Kashimo is the perfect individual to flicker this energy. Not only is Kashimo quite literally electricity based or lightning based, the mindset that Kashimo has is the worst person that Hakari probably could fight, at least for what we've seen so far. Kashimo doesn't care about Hakari, he only cares about finding Sukuna, and God forbid he gets a whiff of where Sukuna is or feels his presence, he's gone. He's going to try and leave. I would assume this would throw Hakari off. He wants someone to battle him with the exact same prowess, with this energy, with this intoxicating aura, and when he doesn't receive it, he fizzles out. If something doesn't go the way he likes it, he fizzles out. So even though he has 4 minutes and 11 seconds, I believe, of infinite cursed energy, meaning that he's borderline immortal because the reverse curse technique can constantly heal him even when he's not thinking about it, and that he can constantly open up domains. The only drawback for this, I imagine, is that if he burns out, if he no longer feels the vibe, if he's no longer, quote unquote, on a roll, which is exactly what Yuta kind of reaffirms to us very early on, that when Hakari is on a roll, he is even more powerful than Yuta. Currently for me, this is what makes the most sense. Whether it's believable or not, I'm not entirely sure. It does kind of make sense in the long run. We do need some sort of hard cap or limiter, make sure that our characters aren't getting too obnoxiously strong. Yuta had the exact same limiter, being 5 minutes, that he could constantly be connected to Rika, supplying him this massive pocket of cursed energy. Now don't take these limitations as being bad. These are great. These are things that we need to see where a character's power actually ends, and once we realize that, we can figure out how do we take them potentially even further. This arc, the Culling games, is a place of evolution. It's a place of evolving, and characters are going to have to find it within themselves when they're versing very powerful individuals from 400 years ago, from 1,000 years ago potentially, to really push themselves above and further than what they ever could. You'll notice that even though Hakari is having such a beautiful showcase currently, a very fun one, and him being probably the last individual we see with this much amount of power, we didn't see Yuta's domain. That is the last final thing that we probably won't see till much later on, because that is going to evolve over time. I can imagine Yuta's domain is going to be very powerful, very ridiculous, and very over the top, but something that can most likely be constantly amplified. If Hakari has infinite cursed energy and is borderline immortal, you can imagine Yuta's is something else entirely. Theoretically, it has to somewhat scale over it if we're following that line of progression. So even though you might feel cheesed about the idea that we didn't get to see Yuta's domain, and Hakari has kind of replaced that want for one, we'll eventually get his in the future, don't worry. There's a perfectly good reason why it was left out, and I imagine it's because it's probably one of the most powerful domains we'll see within the story other than most likely Gojo's. And if we had that prior to Hakari, you can see how potentially Hakari's character, his ability, even his domain couldn't overtower Yuta's performance. So of course, cut Yuta's performance short, escalate Hakari even further, and naturally it's more progressive. It's more fulfilling, especially because you have Panda in there as well. You have Kashmir being a very intoxicating individual. It makes a lot more sense in that regard. Keep somewhat repeating this, but Hakari is most likely going to be the end of stage 1 for the Culling games. Stage 2 is where we start getting introduced to other individuals that will most likely become more proficient, more important, more empowering. You've noticed that Maki has been left out in its entirety is because she doesn't need this type of development as of yet, but we will most likely get a fight for her, and I wouldn't be surprised if she is the first one introduced in stage 2. Not only does the looping of characters kind of make sense, but her showcase of power, a fight that is perfect for her, would be a great introduction to this new uprise of individuals. For me personally, it's only going to get more complex, more crazy, more powerful, and more dire. The situation is evolving, it's changing. It's not going to be just this style of storytelling all the way to the end. The Culling games has a different effect behind it. It's not what we think it is. Tengen is playing a different game. Kenjaku is playing a different game. For some reason, Miwa is on the scene. I don't know how she's going to compete with anyone within the story, but you never know at this point. I would say it's safe to assume that we are very close to something. We're very close to change. Maybe Sukuna finally makes his appearance in some way, shape, or form. Or we get introduced to much older individuals from 1,000 years ago. People to rival Angel, who I believe is currently the only person from 1,000 years ago. Even with all of this, everything has been super exciting, super enjoyable. Hakari's showcase has been nothing but brilliant. Backing off of Yuta's also incredibly brilliant. It's been a fun time. With that, however, leave a like, subscribe. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.